So, hi everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Vibe Tribe. Today, we're talking to Louis Neil Corsten, and I've got Alex Searle with me as well. And this is a special edition in that we're not going to be coding anything today. We're talking to Louis about an app that he's created. He's a South African, now living in Silicon Valley, and he's got an app called Spock. Louis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.
So, firstly, I just want to find out, Alex and I are both different levels of Trekkie, with Alex being a level 1 Trekkie and me being kind of like a level 3 Trekkie. How much of a Trekkie are you, and are there any copyright issues with calling your app Spock?
Yes, we get that question almost every single time. So, no, not actually, believe it or not. It's actually quite similar to Palantir, right? Palantir
Sure,
is
comes from
essentially
Never Heard.
based on Lord of the Rings. So, very similar concept. I think we've done our homework in terms of the IP stuff, who owns the rights, how does that work, etc. And no, we seem to be in the clear. As a matter of fact, there are actually three other AI companies with the name or Spock
Wow.
in it. Someone has cleared the path for us to now go and take that number one spot over the next little while.
Right. So you've sent like a little like decoys into the wild and they haven't been shot yet. So
Yeah,
kind of like following along.
you got to see what happens, right?
Right. But what's like, obviously Spock has been chosen for a very specific reason. Why did you choose the name, and what is its intrinsic connection to the way the app works and what it's for?
So it's actually part of a bigger conversation. I'll give a high level overview around the journey because we were not always Spock. We were actually Spock very recently, to be honest,
Hmm.
literally a month ago. We were
Yeah.
actually always a company called Booked for a very long time. And we built essentially AI technology in the reading space, working with the big global publishers. However, our core focus was always AI fundamentally, and we very recently started doubling down on the pure AI side of things. And then along with that, we realized we are essentially, we've got a new focus, a new mission, a new long-term idea around what AI should look like. And we need to actually kind of break from the past of reading. And so we knew we needed to change, or at least, we needed a new identity, a new name. So hence Spock was born. So we actually started as Booked. Spock was only very recently implemented or chosen. It was actually our CTO, Ty, his idea. But as soon as he said it, I knew he was spot on correct because, as you guys all know, Spock's role in Star Trek is a very interesting one. He's got this Vulcan and human lineage, the highly logical, highly intelligent, but then also the emotional side of the human. And then he's this essentially co-pilot, if you will, to Captain Kirk, right? So he's always highly intelligent, highly logical, but he's got this empathy, this emotional side to him, helping Captain Kirk in essentially any realm or any one of his requirements, if you will. I'm trying to keep those high levels. That's and as soon as Tyron said that, or as soon as he said that, I knew, this is essentially exactly what we want to build: a highly logical, highly accurate, and this is maybe something for a bit later, but a very truthful, precise AI that can help you co-pilot and come in next to you in any endeavor you are embarking on.
Right.
I can confirm, as the resident sort of top Trekkie nerd here, that it's the concept is great, because not only is Spock the logical one with all the the understanding of how things should be and the endless wisdom, but it also allows Captain Kirk, and I suppose everybody else on the Enterprise too, to kind of be the human that they need to be, and they can kind of rely on that sense of logic and things always going right in a really good way. And that's in a sense what your tool does. So yeah, the logic holds. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Yeah, and it sounds fantastic to say, just go Spock it.
Spock it. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
If you could verb it, then amazing. Yeah, as well. It's a name that has
Yeah.
cultural cachet, of course. It's catchy. It's better than Booked, I will say.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so it's a highly logical co-pilot who helps the Captain Kirks, which tend to beam down to the planet for no obvious reason, endangering the captain, make rash decisions, go and punch things, like help him accomplish his goals without getting eaten by an alien. How would you describe, like, what's the short pitch version of what Spock is and how it's differentiated? Because when I started exploring it, you guys have a very good website, but at the same time, there are just such a plethora of AI tools out there right
Mm.
now that even when reading a website, I just feel overwhelmed in terms of like, how do I boil down what is different about this? Like, how does it interact or not interact with the tools that I already use? Do I need it? Do I not? Like, how do you kind of pitch Spock to people?
So just as a fun side note, that website you saw is fully vibe coded. So I know that's a big topic for you guys. The
Yeah,
Spock itself is very much not vibe coded, but the website itself is. We kind of run quickly with those types of things. But So to Spock, and I think why it exists in the first place. So again, I'm going to just harken back to our time working with the publishers and reading and stuff like that. We built very, very powerful and not necessarily complicated, but intricate AI. Now, we learned a lot of lessons there in terms of how you build AI, what's the ideal, etc. And that's why we started doubling down on Spock. And a big thing we realized was you always are essentially handicapped by the current model you're using. So if you're subscribed to ChatGPT, you have access to their best model, which they've not had the best model for the last 3 months, pretty much. So whichever one you're subscribed to, you're kind of, capped to the best model they have at that moment in time.
Mhm.
Whereas each model excels in slightly different things. Some are bigger context windows, some are a little bit more creative, some are better at logic and coding, etc. Now, when we were building AI in the reading space, we actually swapped between the models very often, depending on what the user wanted, what the user needed. But it was not something the user had to think about because the book or their reading experience was the primary focus. The AI was the secondary focus. So what that means is we really had to simplify the AI and swap between these models automatically because we realized the users don't care what 4.0 or O3 or 2.5 Pro, like what does that all mean? What's the difference? Why is it important, etc. That I would say is the first big differentiator is that we are what I call a multi-model general purpose assistant, which means when you ask a question, whichever model is the best to answer that specific type of question will do so, which means you get the benefit of them all. So you're uploading massive documents, that's fine, it can handle it because the models that work with your documents are those with the biggest context windows. You're asking creative style question, deep research style question, whatever it may be, we're swapping the models in and out depending on which one's best for the tasks. Instead of using a GPT or ChatGPT, you use Spock because you can work with bigger files. You have models that are a bit better aligned for logical answers, etc. So the multi-model framework's the big one. The second one is security. We obviously were forced to be probably one of the most secure platforms because of our relationship with the publishers and the fact that we had all of their IP. So especially with how our AI interacts with their IP, their content. So we went through quite a lot of security checks, security passes and hurdles. Data privacy and security is it's essentially one of the fundamental pillars on which we're built. And then just lastly, affordability. We are essentially half the price of a ChatGPT, but you're getting better models in certain situations. So those are kind of the three big differentiators. I won't touch on all the smaller things, but those are the three big overarching aspects we kind of focus on. And then I would say probably our long-term ambition, which is, we don't have to dive too deeply into this now, but it's what I call decentralized AI. So one of my biggest fears in AI is not necessarily the Terminator style outcome, but power kind of centralizing to one or two companies, and they can actually decide what this model acts like, how it engages with the user, etc. So that's what that problem when you get those sycophantic models where it's kind of a yes man, but doesn't actually help you in your very task. So truthfulness and accuracy is paramount to us. And the ability to provide a platform over the long term, which people can use, people or companies can use to deploy their own models, train it, post-train it, etc., and then have an interface to interact with those models with all the feature sets they come to expect, like image generation, deep research, all of those things. That's kind of the long-term idea behind what we want to do is move towards a place of decentralized AI, where you don't need to be locked into one or two of the top model providers. You can actually just deploy your own stuff, or you're in control of your own AI. That's essentially the future we want to move to, is give each person the ability to choose their own AI.
Right. And have you worked directly with with OpenAI, with Anthropic, in order to kind of, did you have to get permission to do this, or is this kind of like built into their user agreements, like you're allowed to use them in the application layer like this?
Yes, and yes, we have worked. I obviously lived in San Francisco for a very long time. So I actually worked with a lot of startups and the big AI labs. Really got to understand how they're building, what they're building, how they're thinking about things, and then just build relationships with them to get kind of the sneak peek into the next generation of models a bit earlier, know what's coming, how we can incorporate that, etc. So we do have those working relationships. But what I would say is for anyone else looking to dive into the world of AI, you don't necessarily need those one-on-one, those working relationships to get started. You can just build on top of their APIs if you want to. So it's a yes and a yes. Yes, we've got the relationships, but we don't really need them. We can just build on top of their their APIs. Look at Cursor or Windsurf or one of those guys. They're also kind of slotting in the different models. Obviously, they're very specific to coding, though.
So, quick side question to the vibe coding thing, because you mentioned, and the website's great. What's your favorite vibe coding app to use for building websites?
Well, I think that's quite a multi-layer. It depends, and I know that's not the answer everyone's looking for. That one was built with Lovable. I think Lovable is a good product, especially if you really aren't technical. Lovable's where you should be looking. If you are a little bit more technical and want slightly more granular control, I do think Cursor is very good. It just remains number one, in my opinion, in that. Although we do see Copilot inside VS Code doing super well as well. We're actually testing and using it quite a bit internally. That seems to be working really, really well. So if you're a little bit more technical, Copilot in VS Code or Cursor. If you're not really that technical, Lovable. So fortunately, our team, everyone is essentially technical. I am myself quite technical as well. So we do tend to get stuck in the weeds in the code itself. But for that landing page, we want to get that out, be able to iterate really quickly. So Lovable is what I use there.
And I ask because I use Replit quite a bit. What's your opinion on that?
I think Replit's very good. I do think that agent they built, I don't know if you saw the user growth graph, but it is absolutely insane. I think it took them like 6 or 7 years to get to 10 million users and then less than a year to get to 100. I may be mistaken there in my exact numbers, but it's something along those lines, which is just ridiculous. And that aligns very well with when they released that agent and when that agent started doing really well. So Replit is awesome. I haven't played around with it too much recently, but from what I know, Replit is really good. From what I've played with it, it is really good, especially if you're kind of in the middle between technical and non-technical, because it is kind of a one-stop shop to deploying your code, integrating your database. I mean, those are all stuff that non-technical people, it's really difficult to deal with, integrating a database and deploying this, the DevOps side. You just don't want to be dealing with that. So that's why I do give Lovable and Replit their flowers. They really have made that quite easy to get something up and running quite quickly, get something connected to a database quite quickly. So yeah, no, I think Replit is great.
Yeah, I also do enjoy that it shows it's working a little bit, so that even if you're non-technical, you at least get exposed to the jargon and the language, and eventually over time you start building up an idea of what's happening. And I've used Lovable and I enjoy it, but I do enjoy having the context of what's going on in the Replit sidebar. With Lovable, it's just like you just wait and then the thing's there. It's quite like surprise. Alex, before we dive into a quick look at the interface of Spock, do you have any questions before I continue?
Yeah, no, just kind of agreeing with you guys. I think that these tools are incredibly useful because they are kind of decentralizing in their nature. Louis, I used to work for a blockchain startup, and where everything is about decentralization, and part of that is a philosophical kind of thread that definitely appeals to me, and I think to many millions of people as well, where by using a technology or by doing it in a certain way, whether it's computing, whether it's managing your money, we all kind of want to feel like there's an alternative where we can stick it to the man, or where we can take some control back of what we're doing, whether it's our privacy or our money or how we build tools and all that. So it's great that these tools exist, even if it's something where there's a particular learning curve that someone like me or John have to kind of learn in order to fill the space of our non-coding experience, because we're not coders, we're not techies at all, and now we're like, oh, look at this page I made, look at this app I made. So it's fun and it's interesting, and even if it does also push things out to the point where there's a whole lot of debugging we got to do, and it takes us working with the agent another 20 hours in order to fix the code because it's broken it so many times, it still sort of decentralizes things. It still puts power of these incredible tools into the hands of people that otherwise would never have had it. So I think that that's awesome, and that you can't sing that praise loud enough, I think.
Well, I think the big thing is, I'm incredibly thankful China is on the open source war path. I think it's very important for the end consumer, regardless of where they are. It's very, very important this technology doesn't proliferate to one or a handful of organizations. We saw and I will speak to this, I don't really mind speaking to this, we saw in ChatGPT's model a month or two ago they had to actually pull it back because it was too much of a yes man. You could give it a terrible business idea and it would say, yep, that's great, let's get started.
Totally.
That's very, very dangerous. And if ChatGPT was your only option as a consumer, and people didn't have the ability to say, hey, something's wrong, let's compare it to someone else and see it's much more difficult to get to the point where that's in your control. So, and it's very dangerous because these companies start optimizing for usage and not truth. So you optimize for usage, and you obscure the truth a little bit because you want people to spend hours on the application, get market share. That's very, very dangerous. So I'm a big believer in decentralization in general. I think it is important for a free market to play a very important role, especially in AI. And I'm very glad we got to a point where it is fairly competitive. We don't just have one company that's aggregated or accrued market share and accrued everything. We actually have a very competitive landscape, which not only drives prices down, obviously, but gives the option to the end consumer to then pick the model they want. I mean, if you think into the future, you're raising a child, your child, you have certain beliefs, values, whatever it may be that you want to raise your child with. But now all children are going to be raised hand in hand with AI in the future. It's inevitable. But now you're locked into this one company's idea or vision of what good principles are. Your child is going to be raised in that light. This is maybe an over exaggerated example, but to give the parents the choice to have the AI that's accompanying their child throughout their development stages be something that aligns with the parents' kind of ideas, principles, whatever. I think just giving the choice to people is very important. That is maybe an extreme example, but I do think it just illustrates the idea behind why the end consumer or why everyone does need a choice when it comes to AI, and not just one group accrue all the power and all the market share, because they essentially then have a monopoly and can make decisions. That's very difficult or that could be very detrimental to society. We kind of saw it and play out to some extent with social media, right?
Exactly, with Google and Meta.
Mm.
Three things that come out of that is, for me, there's such a small step between where we are now, where the parent companies of these models are kind of ostensibly not politically leaning, right? But it only takes a few threats from Trump, and we've seen this with Meta, I think, and possibly with Google as well, where they start kind of like bending a little bit. Because imagine in ChatGPT becomes the conservative model, because everything in America seems to have some kind of political bias. CNN is literally just a liberal mouthpiece. Fox News is literally just a conservative mouthpiece. So where we are now feels relatively balanced, but I can see that. And then suddenly, as you say, your kid is now being raised by the conservative model, or at least is interacting with it at school all the time with a model that will give it like whatever version of the truth whoever's coding the thing wants, which is very dangerous. So that's one thought. This second thought is why I asked the question about whether you work with OpenAI and whether they're happy for you to use their API in this way to decentralize, is that surely that's kind of like anti their business goals, because their goal is to gain as much market share as possible and be the dominant model, whereas you are essentially like using their various models to limit that if you can. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think we can already see Claude switched off API access to Windsurf when OpenAI bought Windsurf. So Windsurf's another vibe coding piece of software, if you will. So we've already seen that companies are willing and will switch off API access or access to third parties if it does not align with their interests. However, I think it will be very telling if OpenAI decides to switch off API access for us based on what we're doing and the route we're walking. Because at the end of the day, we have alternatives available. If OpenAI was the only player, then yes, it's bad for us, but they're not the only player. They don't currently have the best models. There are other models we can use instead of OpenAI. And I actually think that move is very indicative of actually very telling of what their stance is on AI. In other words, we don't want decentralized AI. We don't want the end consumer to have choice. For us to run open source model is something we can very easily do to fill the gap of where OpenAI's missing API is. So it's an interesting topic, an interesting concept. I truthfully don't actually think that'll be a problem. I don't think they'll pull that. It doesn't seem to align with how they want to move or be perceived in the market. But even if they do, for whatever reason, we have alternatives, and I think it definitely paints an interesting picture in the market of where each company's focus lies. So yeah, that's kind of interesting journey to see how that plays out.
Sure. Last thing before we have a look at the interface, I've got a very selfish question, which is I bought ChatGPT Plus back when, kind of like when close to when they first launched, right? How locked in am I? Like, because this is a question when, all these different models get upgraded and this one's now better and that one's worse. And here's DeepSeek, which is free. But all of my chat history, all of my work has been done in ChatGPT. From your perspective, is that an inhibitor to just turning it off and turning something else on? Or like, what strategy do you recommend?
There's actually two levels to this. The second one is probably part of a longer conversation, so I won't touch on that. That's essentially when each user has control of their own data. In other words, self-hosting or running their own database with an AI layer on top. But anyway, I won't talk to that. To directly answer your question, I don't think there's immense lock-in at the moment because it's not actually very difficult to extract all of the memories or all the key concepts OpenAI knows about you. And then if you switch over to Claude or Spock to then essentially say, listen, this is everything you need to know about me, commit this to memory. That's a very quick process. The lock-in isn't really immense, to be honest. And I'm sure OpenAI are very much working on this, but we are obviously working on what it looks like when you've really built out this concept of memory, because memory is essentially context, a lot of context for this model. What it looks like from a feature set point of view when memory is really fleshed out, how that integrates, what it does, etc., etc. So I do think over time, you'll see the lock-in get higher and higher and higher, but for now, we haven't seen that to be too much of an issue. We actually have a prompt that people use to literally just extract all of their memory from OpenAI and then move to Spock and, for example, say, listen, this is what you need to know about me. Please remember it. And then Spock will just remember all of that stuff for you moving forward. So right now, not much of a lock-in, but we're actively building towards making it more robust, and I'm sure everyone else is. So I do believe over time you will have more and more of a lock-in.
Right. So, from where I'm standing right now, Spock is a very kind of tempting offering for me because A, it's more affordable, and B, it's pulling from multiple models and all the other advantages you've kind of mentioned. And I imagine when we get into it that there's a little bit more guidance on building custom agents or a little bit more kind of like capability in that way, because ChatGPT can do it, but it's not dumb enough for me yet. In terms of like, especially for me, I can do it. I've just been lazy enough not to. Alex has built one for every one of his clients. I think I want to do that as well. But so I guess the core question is Spock a replacement for a ChatGPT or a Claude or an Anthropic that you're paying a monthly for?
Yes. We actually have quite a few people that have already canceled their various other subscriptions. Most people don't actually need as much AI as they think they need, is what we've realized. They just want something quick, reliable, and affordable that can help them with their tasks to get 30 minutes back a day. So we actually have quite a few people who have already canceled their other subscriptions in favor of Spock. So yes, that's a definite, I would say. Each company obviously has slightly different nuances in how they approach various things. I think you touched on the concept of agents, which is something we are very much investing in over the long term. Each provider has something resembling this concept of agents. What I will also, just a disclaimer from my end, we use the word agents, but I'm always the first to say we aren't yet building fully end-to-end autonomous agents. It's very complicated. They're not actually as useful and or accurate as I think many of the big companies would want you to believe. They do tend to break. And the problem with an autonomous agent is it makes one mistake and then that mistake is compounded while it does the rest of its tasks. So we're quite big on this concept of basic agents or bots, if you will, where it's a human in the loop. So we work with quite a few corporates and we actually work with them on a services-based level, sit with their teams, help them not only learn how to use AI, but how to deploy AI and actually build these agents for themselves. And as an example, one of the teams, it's a marketing team, they've got an agent where they'll upload their Google Analytics and their social media analytics. The agent will then analyze that, do research, benchmark it, understand where the problems are, etc., draft a report. They then have this report, they can have a look through it, and then they upload it to a second agent, which then takes that based on the report and actually builds the strategy or the structure for the next week or two or however long for their social media campaigns and marketing. So it's a human in the loop where you're kind of building an agent or a bot to really get going on your repetitive tasks, and then you're kind of connecting them to get the full end result. But you're always kind of verifying the output of these agents along the way. Now, a big thing, again, that we focus on is simplicity. So we really wanted to make it as easy as possible to build an agent. It's essentially a one-step process. And we will actually be introducing, probably in the next week, a find an agent feature, which is just pre-built agents. PDF processing. If you have complicated PDFs you upload that need to be converted to Excel, social media research, social media marketing research, whatever. There'll be a list of agents. You don't even need to build them. You can just click and use it. We're not big fans of the community built agents and that being available to everyone, maybe in the future, but we've realized that that quickly is a slippery slope, because then the users are flooded with so many things that do so many different things, but none of it is actually purpose built for what you want. So we're much bigger in providing more templates, if you will, and you can just tweak it a little bit based on your own use case. So simple AI is at the core of what we want to do.
Right. Awesome. Let's have a look at it, if you don't mind sharing your screen and maybe just showing us the back end, as you said, not the code back end.
Give me a second. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Let me just
Get rid of
close that. All right, so I'm sure many of you have, or you've all used kind of these general purpose AI systems. So none of this should look too unfamiliar to you. We did largely start with a more traditional UI or interface for AI. However, we're actually working with someone very talented around what the future of human AI communication looks like. So we started here because our core challenge is initially was technological or technical on the back end, making these models work together, etc. But we are going to be moving to a place where this UI or this interface will start looking more and more different. But to give you guys a quick tour, obviously, because of that multi-model framework I mentioned previously, the models we use when working with documents and Excel sheets and images and whatever, they're very, very specialized, and they can actually handle they've got massive context windows. So you can upload huge documents, significantly bigger than what you could with a ChatGPT, for example, work with that, very accurate, etc. So the document processing is a core component of Spock at the moment. So it's most of our clients who really use it quite a lot for. So you're working with images, as mentioned, PowerPoints, Excels, all of those things. Deep research, everyone kind of has a version of deep research, have our own, obviously. This is just the ability to essentially do a Google search on steroids. When you ask an AI a deep research question, it does a bunch of different Google searches, synthesizes all of those information, provides you with a final report. We don't limit hours, so it's unlimited deep research you can use. Image mode, I am quite proud to say I think we probably have one of the better editing or image editing functionality on the market. ChatGPT is very good, though. I will give them their flowers there. They really do have a good model for that. But the ability to create and edit images is really, really powerful on Spock. And again, there are no limits to that, so you can go crazy. And then memory, that's a really big one. You'll see on the right, I've got the little brain. I won't show all my memory, but that is just all the memory you have that you build up as you use Spock. So memory is quite a big thing. We invest quite a lot of time in to make sure that your answers are relevant. Spock really does become that co-pilot to you as Captain Kirk, essentially. So memory is a really big thing. You've got your voice, just as with the other assistants. Then on the left are your collections. I won't speak too much to. That's essentially your folders, your chats. What is really cool is these collections start building up their own memory. So that's a really cool, nifty feature. But agents is probably the big one. You'll see I have many different agents. I've got this deep learning agent. As an example, if I want to learn about SEO, this agent has been built to understand what it is going to be receiving from me. It does a bunch of different research, a bunch of different work on the back end. It does take a bit longer now because I've given it very strict instructions as to what it must or what it can and can't do.
Can I
using a little bit of humor? Yeah.
In one of your videos, this is actually something I thought of earlier that I just wanted to highlight for viewers/listeners, is in one of your videos you mentioned that you have built into your prompts, you ask the AI to ask you clarifying questions and to comment,
Yes.
right? Which I think a lot of people don't do. They just take, they give the thing the prompt, it comes up with a thing and they say yes. But you have specifically asked for it to go like, okay, did you mean this or this? Or here's some more details I'd like. Can you just quickly explain that strategy?
So I would say there's two things to that. The first is just to directly answer you. Generally, when building all of my personal agents, and this is something I suggest to everyone, so I've got quite a few. In these agents, in the actual, let me just find a example. I think in this PDF processing one, in here somewhere, it very clearly states if there's any ambiguity or before you answer, please ask me any clarifying questions. So every time I use this agent, I'll ask a question. It won't answer me yet. It'll first ask questions to make sure it understands the full context so that the answer is significantly better. This was actually part of my very first class. So just on that, we do actually these weekly AI classes on Tuesdays. just for anyone to come and watch if they want. But in one of the classes, I spoke to this concept of helping an AI with context. Asking an AI to ask clarifying questions is one of the most useful things you can do to get better responses over time. The extra 2 minutes, 3 minutes it takes to answer the AI is well worth it. So as a tip, I would highly suggest everyone just as part of your routine, start asking your AI more and more to first ask you clarifying questions before it just responds. So that's to that initial kind of concept. The second thing I would say is one thing we have done is called this prompt guide. So many people kind of will say, help me with a marketing campaign. But how you ask a question is often more important than almost what you ask, to be honest. By giving an AI a role, like saying you are an AI assistant tasked with X, this is what you have to do, this is extra context. It's just how you prompt, how you speak to your AI. I can just send that or use that. So instead of saying help me with a marketing campaign, the prompt guide will suggest, listen, you rather should have said you are an expert in marketing with years of experience in SEO based on X, Y, and Z. This is extra context you need, etc. So we want people to learn how to use AI while they use AI. So that's a really important topic. And I think those are both kind of related.
Awesome. Thanks.
Then I will, there's a few smaller things. I won't touch on all of them, but just lastly, we do work with teams, companies, enterprises. So you've got this team management, but in here, you can actually create agents, or we've seen teams create agents for the entire company. So the finance guys will have a invoice processing agent. Everyone's got access to it. The admin set it up, and the team is now working to do that together. They're sharing the chats with one another, collaborating on it, etc. So that concept of multiplayer AI is something we do focus on quite a lot. Is how do you get people collaborating when using AI together, i.e., sharing chats, working with shared agents, being able to share agents with one another. So I can just share this agent with you guys, and you can just start using it immediately. So the long-term vision for us is very much in decentralized AI, but we also really focus on what we call multiplayer AI. It's not just you and your AI, but it can be you, your AI, and your colleagues, co-workers, whatever else. So those are just some of the topics and some of the concepts we focus on. Just lastly, what I would definitely want to mention is our native web search functionality is incredible. We use probably the best model in the market for that. So every time you ask a question, it's very much rooted in real-time knowledge because it will know when to perform web research. You've got all your citations it showed. You can go double check it, etc. So it's a very, very useful tool to have. And I think that's the very quick tour.
Great, thank
Could
you.
I ask a quick question? Just in terms of
Yes.
functionality, how without maybe going into too much detail, but just generally, how were you able to open up that context window, open up the sort of the persistent memory piece? And I suppose for everyone just listening, that what I'm asking about is to put it into context with ChatGPT, for example. If we've all been there running different prompts, having long conversation threads with it. It eventually forgets things and it starts to hallucinate, makes things up and all that. So you've been able to kind of fix that in a sense where it remembers what you tell it and ultimately learns from the conversations you have with it. How were you able to kind of build that into your architecture?
So there's a very technical answer to this, but I'll try and keep it as high level as possible. Essentially, there's two aspects here. You've got persistent memory, and then you've got pure context window size. So you can think of memory as two things. The memory you have in a conversation in one chat, that's very relevant to the context window size of these models. So Claude, for example, a very, very small context window. So if you use Claude or Anthropic, you'll see they do tell you pretty quickly, listen, this chat's getting a bit long, please start another one. So that's your kind of memory to that conversation. Then you've got your persistent or cross-chat memory, which is outside of a conversation. So it remembers things from a conversation that can be contributed to a later one. Now, each company, everyone is approaching that in a slightly different way. We've got our own way. OpenAI has their own way. So those are your two levels of memory, if you will. Now, just to the first on the context window size, when you ask a question, we've got that intelligence layer, and you'll see it even says determining best model. That first decides which is the best big model to use. You can imagine there were a lot of technical challenges in swapping between models during a conversation because each one works a bit differently. So what we need to do is we actually kind of chunk your conversations or RAG your full conversations back into the model or the relevant aspects of it. So if you have a super long conversation, we'll break up the parts that exceed that model's context window, break that up, and essentially kind of chunk them into themes or topics. Obviously, I don't want to give too many secrets away here, but we'll break it up and chunk it and then feed it back in if relevant. So we essentially create persistent memory, or we use the mechanisms that we use for persistent memory inside a chat for that chat's memory. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, we just break the context down as much as possible, and then we'll always favor models with bigger context windows if chats get longer. You kind of just strike a balance between that being intuitive for the end user, and then obviously with persistent memory, that just kind of happens all the time. All of your questions and responses and all of these things get kind of analyzed, and should this be saved, should it not be saved, when should we retrieve it, and so on and so forth.
Out of interest, which model powers your image generation? Or in general, maybe it switches.
We switch that actually very often. Image is the one we find really does switch quite a bit. At the moment, we're using, so we obviously will have a sequence of models. It's not just one. If one fails, it falls back to another one. So we actually have several models at play. The one we use for editing, which I suggest everyone check out, it's called Flux Context. Very good model for editing. Very, very, very good. We don't use the GPT model. It's very expensive and very slow. So we actually use the Flux Context model for editing. For generation, we actually swap the generation one very often, to be honest. Sometimes we even use the Flux Context for generation, but we found the Google models are pretty good as well. But then you obviously have, for example, your Stable Diffusion. The generation one we really do swap a lot. At the moment, it's the Google suite, but the editing has been stable for some time, and that's one of the Flux models, the Flux Context model specifically.
I think it was yesterday I noticed that Google has now built into my workspace this new app called Vids, which is using VO2 and VO3, and it's got a very simple kind of timeline editor and templates and all that. So it appears that they've launched their, because VO3, I think I have the free membership, which gave you through. Oh, we might have lost.
I've still got you guys.
Yeah, we have. And I've lost everyone. Oh, you got me. Okay, great. Have you seen Vids?
Yeah, so yes, I have seen it. Maybe just to comment on it,
I don't know.
we
I haven't properly played around with it. Yeah. Sorry, go
well,
ahead.
the video models are very expensive at the moment, and we haven't actually found them that reliable. So the problem with VO3 is it is incredible, but you spend a lot of credits in building these videos that there's a failure to render, etc. So we do want to focus on affordability and keeping our prices low as possible. And if we introduce video, we have to change those prices, unfortunately. And they just aren't stable enough for us to actually release that into production comfortably. So those interested in video, the new King models are really good, but VO3 is an awesome tool. They really have knocked it out of the park, in my opinion. I'm really looking forward to when they get that a bit more stable and get those prices down a bit, and then we're definitely going to be including those.
Yeah. It's I think it's telling that a lot of the large models have image generation, but if you want video generation, they have a separate thing for that. You pay separately for that as well.
It's a lot of compute.
Yeah. I think we've used a bunch of your time. I want to wrap it up. But I have a couple of follow-on questions. The first one being that when we talked about your prompt asking for further clarification, have you also built in anything in there that's like, don't be such a psychopath? Actually, like, if my argument is dumb, tell me, or if my business plan is stupid, tell me. Like, do you do that?
Yeah, no, very much. I come from a very academic background, so being right is very important, or being factual is very important. So our models, we have been told they're not as engaging as a ChatGPT model, and the response is always, that's by design. It's not supposed to please you, it's supposed to help you. So it will, for example, sometimes push back and say, listen, no, this doesn't make sense. These models, or how we approach, is very much rooted in first principles thinking. So they do, they'll kind of take you through, deconstruct a concept, take you through it, build it back up from there. And then often, and I say often, it doesn't actually align with your initial assumptions, and the model will tell you. It's not overly aggressive or terrible, but we do tend to err on the side of be factual, be correct, be accurate, be truthful, and triple check your work, and don't just optimize for engagement. So yes, virtually everything we do is very much pointed towards that as a foundational concept.
Yeah. Because I was developing something in Replit, and I wanted, once you finish all the quizzes, it shows a I said, like, show a pop-up window saying, well done, you've completed it. And it took kind of like a long time to figure that out. And eventually I said, is a pop-up window the best way to do this? Could it just be a completion page or something? And if you don't know the jargon, which I only largely don't, then you might not even know these different terms. And, Replit said, no, completion page is much easier. Let me do that. Bah, 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 and it was done. And I'm not sure if you can tune Replit's LLM to talk back to you and say, like, actually a pop-up window is going to use quite a lot of compute. I'm not sure if you want to do that, but I'm sure if it hasn't been built now, it's probably being built. But in a lot of use cases, I would really appreciate it going like, hey, here's a much simpler solution to what you're talking about that you might not know about. Would you like me to try that?
Yeah. The problem with coding or vibe coding is they struggle with the front end a lot. So back end is simple because back end it works or it doesn't. It's very black or white. Front end is not like that. So CSS and JavaScript on the front end side, it really does struggle. So we've found the coding agents sometimes they don't themselves know which is the simplest solution, if that makes sense. On the back end, it's very simple to kind of train Replit to tell you, no, this is there's a better way to do this. It's simpler. On the front end, we have found sometimes they trip over themselves a little bit in trying to figure out what the best solution is. So we just err on the side of simplicity always. So just always telling your Replit agent, take the simplest route, or first brainstorm the simplest implementation for this feature or this outcome that I'm looking to achieve. Then let it think first through the simple potential solutions and then pick the simplest one. So simple for front end is what we found always works best. And then first asking it to brainstorm what the simplest possibly could be helps a lot. It helps the agent itself wrap its head around the complexities or the variables involved.
Right. So you actually do, as you were talking about earlier, you put a little bit of work in the upfront so to save yourself a bunch of time at the end.
Oh yes, always. It saves a lot of time as well. When you kind of, especially with vibe coding, maybe just to speak to vibe coding quickly, I would highly suggest everyone just have. I know some of the applications you can add a .md file, which has like structure or rules or whatever for the agent to follow, and then they just tell it reference that rules.md, follow that. But to have a strict guidelines or strict set of rules for these agents to follow that they need to execute before they even start coding will save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches. Essentially, just listen before I want to build feature X. Do not program anything yet. First, ask clarifying questions to make sure you understand what feature X is, how it slots into the system as a whole, and then show me your thinking. Then to read through its thinking is very useful. And then to say, okay, now let's brainstorm 3 different ways feature X could be simpler or could be better, whatever. Then go through that process and then only saying, okay, now based on everything we've discussed, let's implement feature X step by step. That's a very simplistic example, but that concept of first speaking to your AI and first doing some upfront work helps a lot over the long term.
Yeah, I think it's going to save me a lot of money when I
Oh yes.
When I told it, could this be better as a completion page? It wasn't like, yeah, would you like me to do it? It just changed the whole app,
Yeah.
And if I didn't like it, I would have to go back and that'll be another checkpoint and more money and all that, So yeah, I get what you're just saying. Like,
that's why that line that sentence right there is probably the most important thing for any vibe coder to know is just always add, don't code this yet. Let's first finish speaking about what it is we want to do before you start just chopping and changing things. And we found some of the models, for example, the Claude, I remember when 3.7 came out, that was the most irritating model because you would ask it for a small feature change and then it would go change things that are completely unrelated. It would just change your UX because of things it needs to. They've toned that down, but it just shows how frustrating. Yeah, they've toned that down, so it's good now. But yeah, that sentence of saying "don't start coding yet" is it's going to save a lot of time.
It's funny because that's something that I will now kind of like copy paste in every time I'm planning something to build, which makes it a classic case of a feature that should be built into the app. But at the same time, it is a feature that will cost them money, right? They'll be using compute to not do a checkpoint.
No, I'd be very surprised if Replit didn't have a mechanism in which to build this, either through having your own custom system instructions or being able to add a rules.md file to your project structure. I think you could probably do both, to be honest. Again, I haven't used Replit in a little while, so I'm not too familiar with their setup at the moment. But I would be very, very surprised if they didn't have either one of those two, which allowed you to provide custom rules like, listen, don't code until we've gone through a round of questions and brainstorming on every instruction, or whatever your preferred mechanism is. I really do think there will be a way to bake that in so you don't have to say it every single time. I'm just not sure how they would do that because I haven't used them in a while. So it's either custom system instructions or adding a rules, essentially just a text file, and then always referencing in your instructions to the text file saying, please read rules.md before we do anything on this feature. Then it reads that first. But yeah, so there will definitely be a way. I'm just not sure exactly how Replic's situation looks at the moment.
Sure. So to close off, I see we've lost Alex. That could be a Spain thing, could be a time thing. But I just wanted to ask, so your advice for people watching this now who have, let's say, an account with ChatGPT like me, but I'm very, I want to get into Spock. So my thinking right now is that I get a Spock account, and for the first month or two, I pay for both. I use them. I make sure that Spock's got everything I need. I find a way to export everything I've got in ChatGPT, bring it over to Spock, see if it's all working hunky-dory, and then cancel ChatGPT. Is that a strategy that you recommend, or do you have another kind of a way to do the transition essentially? Because I think that although you say that there's not, technically a lot of lock-in, I think people feel like almost, especially with something like an AI, almost an emotional connection to the thing they've been using for 6 months and chats to them like, hey, John, that kind of thing.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Look, at the end of the day, all these models have things they're good at and things they're not good at. All these companies have things they're good at and not good at. We are better than GPT in certain ways. They're better than us in other ways. And I think it's just about finding what really resonates with you. I think they're all starting to converge where the differences in all the different platforms aren't that great anymore. So it's kind of just finding the one really resonates with you. The tone of the AI, how it answers, its thoroughness with the X, Y, and Z. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it just comes down to and in all honesty, don't just try Spock, try a number of them. There are many different providers out there with very good products. And I would suggest try 2 or 3 for a month. You'll very quickly realize whether this makes sense for you or not. And then once you have one, you can start using that a little bit more and then slowly start canceling the rest. There's no urgency or need to do this immediately overnight. I would just say experiment a little bit. Each one of them have their own nuances and different ways of doing things. There's no need to feel like you're forced or locked into one. But when you find one you like, then I do believe that's a good one to stick with because they generally won't fall too far behind, essentially. All of them will kind of always have parity on most aspects. So just finding that one you really like that you kind of vibe with and doubling down there. But there's no rush. I mean, take your time, play around with 1 or 2 of them. A month should be more than enough time to really get a good idea of how each one operates and what it offers and what it doesn't offer. And then from there, you kind of know what the path forward is.
Great. Okay. And then final question, I'm going to swing it just back to podcasting for a second here. I have had this idea that I want you to quickly sense check for me. It's that we've got members of our guild who have let's say 100 plus, 300 plus episodes, right? Podcasts are notoriously hard to search. You have to, scrolling back in Spotify is a mission. You don't know exactly what the content is. And which to a degree, that's why transcripts exist and show notes exist, right? So I've been toying with the idea of, let's say, taking we've got a show called the Muscle Growth Podcast. It's got quite a few episodes. Let's say we transcribe all of those. We teach a custom GPT all that stuff. We give it all of that information and we make the muscle growth GPT. Could that podcaster then say, okay, cool, for 50 Rand a month, you can chat to my GPT about the content that I've, the interviews that I've done with experts about muscle growth and all that. Or you can use it, even if it's just as simple as saying, someone says, I want to find out about sarcopenia. And it says, okay, in episodes 3, 16, and 52, we talk about sarcopenia. Here's a link to the audio and to the transcript if you just want to read it. Do you think that there's value in that for listeners?
Yes, we actually worked on
From a technical
something.
perspective, is it possible?
It is possible. We've actually worked with something quite similar with the publishers, to be honest. I mean, podcast book or collection of books.
Sure.
At the end of the day, content is content. In terms of having these, so obviously I wouldn't say GPT because that's a ChatGPT's project, our product. I'd obviously just refer to a Spock agent. Nonetheless, they all kind of essentially get to the same end result. But yes, you can, for example, upload a bunch of transcripts, a bunch of content to a Spock agent and make that available to anyone else for their own needs. They pay you X Rand or dollars a month. That's technically possible and technically already essentially in use. So that's not a challenge on that front. And it is something we've looked at before. So yeah, to answer the question, I think it is valuable. I think people find a lot of value from it. We actually have many people who have built quote unquote agents based on a bunch of different content out there, similar to kind of just grabbing transcripts from podcasts. And they essentially speak to this advisor, if you will. So you've got people that have already pulled podcasts from a bunch of YouTube videos on startups, and they've trained or given the agent all of the transcripts, and this agent now acts as their professional startup advisor. We see that a lot. And it's not just in startups, obviously, it's across a bunch of different fields. Exercise is also a really big one. So, yes, it's possible. It's actually being used at the moment. And I do think there's a lot of value for people.
Awesome. Cool. Louis, I'm sorry for have taken up literally double the amount of time. We've just hit exactly an hour. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate it. It was great chatting to you. Please send my regards to Alex. It was great having him, chatting to him a little bit as well.
Awesome. That was a fake goodbye. Don't do anything yet.